8, 5.
Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today it's time to once again have a look at the suggestions passed to developers for July 2020, and after having a look at the ground vehicles yesterday, it's now time to have a look at the aviation portion. So let's start going ahead. Nothing for the US today, so we start off with Germany from Sub Ryan, and this is the Republic RF-84F 46RE Thunderflash. This was used by the Luftwaffe, and what is kind of interesting about this machine is the fact that this machine by the Luftwaffe was used as a tactical photo reconnaissance fighter. So yeah. One of the interesting things about this is the fact that if you have a look at its armament, it never carried any missiles, it never carried any bombs. The only armament it has is 4 50 caliber machine guns, or 4 12.7mm M3 Brownings with 800 rounds. So yeah, there's this vehicle would be kind of interesting. Its maximum speed was 629 miles an hour, or 1,013 kilometers per hour, and the Germans used it quite a lot. So they were originally operated by the WS-50, and then the WS-30 and WS-50 combined at Erding, and then became the photo reconnaissance wing of the 51, which was formed on the 7th of July 1959. This moved the base of operations to a different area, and a badge depicting a devil with a camera was applied to the fin tips of these aircraft, and this was changed eventually to an owl. And the general idea was after 1960, they actually took up permanent residence in a different place where they were set up before, and this was a place called Egbeck. And the code was obviously EB, and also had a different badge as well, a panther's head. So a lot of changes when it came to this. And then they had 52 aircraft overall, and the Luftwaffe had some Thunderflashes to spare as well, which we used for training, and the surplus examples were used mainly, as I said, just for training purposes. And then later on, the idea was they were going to bring in more, but instead they actually cancelled it to bring in more G91s in the form of G91Rs, which I'm guessing stand for reconnaissance or something similar to that. So yeah, if they were actually built, those, that last set of Thunderflashes, they would have been the last F-84s to actually be constructed. But instead, we have these ones. So yeah, pretty much as simple as that. This is just a really, really beautiful aircraft. It's actually stunning to look at, in my opinion. You can see here, it looks really, really cool, but it is just a photo recon plane, so not a ton of armament. Moving on to something else which struggles with its armament, we have the de Havilland Sea Vixen, the FAW-2. Now, if you don't know what the de Havilland Sea Vixen is, it's actually been talked about quite a lot in the War Thunder community, especially after stuff like the Scimitar being added, and the reason for it is because the Sea Vixen has no guns. It literally has nothing and has to rely on its secondary ordnance options, which it does have some pretty cool secondary ordnance options. It was able to carry 4 de Havilland Red Top infrareds, so the missiles that you see on the Lightning, 4 Fire Streaks, so the missiles that you see on the Javelin, or 28 rockets in a retractable belly tray, 4 SNEB rocket pods with 24 rockets per pod, 2 bullpups with the control pod as well, 2 1,000-pound bombs, or 4 500-pounders. So it does have at least a decent amount of secondary options, but obviously no actual offensive armaments in the form of guns. So where did this machine come from, and why is it another example of British engineering, which was kind of odd and an oddity in the post-Second World War period? So this design originated from de Havilland, and they were creating a proposal for the naval specification for number 4046 and also the RAF specification for F-4446. They created the DH-110. It was intended to cover the requirements for an all-weather night fighter for both navalized and also land-based roles, and as both the Fleet Air Arm and also the Royal Air Force updated their specifications to include strike fighter and long-range capability, the DH-110 project slowly began to take shape as a twin-engine, twin-boom, two-seat aircraft designed around forward-firing gun armament as its primary weapon. And with the look at the design, the Ministry of Supply confirmed that there was interest in the project from both parties, the FAA and also the RAF. So in April 1949, they ordered 7 land-based night fighters and 2 strike fighter prototypes for the RAF, and then 2 more of each for the FAA as well. But in late 1949, when somebody who actually looked at the numbers decided to have a look, basically the prototype orders were cut back from the original numbers, which resulted in major development delays for the DH-110 and also the GA-5. So basically the 2 competing designs, the GA-5 being the Delta Wing Gloucester GA-5, which was around at the time. So the first 2 prototypes of the DH-110s were fitted with a pair of Avon RA-7s. These produced 7,500 pounds of thrust each, and they were placed between each boom and below the high-mounted tailplane. The first prototype, which was known as the WG-236, made its maiden flight on the September of 1951. It would go on to break the sound barrier in 1952, but unfortunately, just like a lot of British prototypes, or even just service vehicles at the time for Britain, there was an unfortunate incident. So the WG-236 at Farnborough, if you don't know what Farnborough Air Show is pretty I suppose, well known historically as somewhere where a bunch of planes were shown off either in prototype form or just as a general, onlookers form. Basically, the aircraft broke apart mid-flight. This killed the crew members. It also killed 29 spectators in September 1952. And it was found that it was an issue with the airframe. Basically, there was a combination of high acceleration and also rate of roll, and the maneuver was forbidden for any later Sea Vixens in operation, even after the structural type and also the skin was reinforced and redesigned. So because of this issue, because of the initial showing basically killing 29 people of the public and also the 2 people operating the machine, the RAF completely lost interest in it, and they decided to choose the Gloucester GA-5 and into super priority production, despite the aircraft's own accidents and issues. The GA-5 would eventually become the Javelin, as we know it, and was the RAF's definitive all-weather fighter in the 1950s, and this spanned 9 variants across 6 years of development. It would be kind of interesting to see more Javelins in the game, but then again, the one we have wasn't exactly well liked. Despite the early impressions, which were of course very poor, and the RAF's cancellations, the FAA, or the Fleet Air Arm, was still interested in the project. Because they needed a new high-performance all-weather fighter to replace their Sea Venoms, which they were using at the time. So de Havilland quickly reconfigured the DH-110. They included higher thrust outputs, so they installed Avon 208 engines. They gave it increased fuel capacity and also missiles as the primary armament. So, the idea was you wouldn't need guns because missiles would be, completely fine in the role. You can ask many countries how that turned out. Not so Well, so the idea was to combine the missiles to start with 4 Aiden cannons, and then, you'd have the secondary armament on other stuff, but they were dropped from the production plane as it was expected that the air-to-air missiles would be more than sufficient for interception duties. There were also a bunch of other changes, such as hydraulically operated folded wings, because obviously it's a FAA fighter, and then also a new cockpit canopy for the pilot, a steerable nose wheel, catapult pickup points, and also a large radome prominently mounted in the nose of the aircraft. So the first production Sea Vixens were sent to Boscombe Down and the HMS Ark Royal for handling and carrier trials, where various flight anomalies were worked out, such as the inclusion of an anti-spin parachute to prevent the aircraft spin, which was considered dangerous and inadvisable on the type. So once again, quite large teething issues. And in later months, several more prototypes would undergo rigorous field testing for operations in extreme weather conditions, the buddy in-flight refueling capabilities, and also photo recon pod fitment. And after all of these service trials were done, the first unit of Sea Vixen FAW-1s was formed in mid-1959 as 892 Squadron. So they're finally, off the ground and running in service. Now, they wanted to improve the FAW-1 for obvious reasons, so they created the FAW-2, and the main difference between them, at least from a gameplay point of view, was that the FAW-2 would be able to use the red top air-to-air missiles, and also an additional pinion fuel tanks in the twin booms. So the first production FAW-2 saw first flight in 1963, and after successful testing of the new armament system, the surviving Mark 1s were upgraded to the FAW-2s. And to be honest, like the machine during the 50s and 60s when it was used didn't really do too much. It doesn't have too many areas where it took over or really shone out compared to a bunch of other ones. But it did have a pretty long service life, and eventually the Sea Vixen stopped being part of frontline operations in 1968 and ended in 1970 when the Phantom FG-1 began to make it into service. And what is kind of interesting is it actually had a longer service life than the Javelin, and the other thing as well is that the accident rate of the Sea Vixen was 38%. So pretty high. Not as high as the Scimitar, but still very high when we compare it to other machines. The next post is from Super Cacti, and what Super Cacti is talking about today, actually no, did I say the person's name? I didn't, sorry. So the last post from Sea Vixen FAW-2 was from Aquila Chrysatos, so there you go. And then we now have a post from Super Cacti who's talking about different turret modifications for British bombers. Now, obviously, during the war, British bombers were upgraded depending on if they required them when it came to their guns, or when it came to their engines, or when it came to anything else. Just like pretty much any other machine, they were upgraded over time. So there was a bunch of different turrets made by, a bunch of different companies, and this is Super Cacti going through a few of them and also showing how to implement them into the game. So yeah, there's a bunch of them, such as a turret, which is a quad 7.7 mount for a Mosquito. You also have the 220mm Hispanos, which you see on stuff, well, the later versions of that turret, I suppose, you see on stuff like the Lincoln, but they did also make them for stuff like the Lancaster, the Halifax, and the Sterling, and also stuff like 20 caliber machine guns. So the first one is, the first example is, as you can see, the Bolton Paul Type H turret. This had two 20mm Hispano Mark IIs, and also you could have it with 50 cals if you wanted. So this was the general design of it. It was designed to be put on pretty much any aircraft. And then you had the Bristol Type B11 Mark I, this pictured here shown mounted on a Mosquito, and it had 4 77mm Browning machine guns in it. Then you had the Bristol Type B12 Mark I turret. This was once again a quad 77 turret, but you can see it has a different setup on it to try and reduce the drag of the plane by smoothing out the turret itself. And also, Super Cacti talks about how to implement these turrets in the game, because what he wants to do is he wants to be able to take these turrets and make them modifications. So let's say you have like a Halifax B Mark IIIA, you can choose to have either the quad 77s, or you can choose to have the 220mm or the 250 cals, which I think is a good idea. He does also talk about how installing these modifications would change the BRs of the vehicle, which is generally something I've talked about quite a lot, which would help the situation of a stock to spaded grind, where if you have a stock vehicle, it should have a different BR from a spaded vehicle. So yeah, it's pretty much as simple as that, being able to add multiple choices for turret modifications for different machines in the game. And there are a bunch of other turret designs, whether they be prototype, proposed, or even developed for the British, which would also be nice to see on different aircraft in the game. The next vehicle we're having a look at is from Milocat, and this is the Kyushu Q1 Tokai. And what this is, well, it looks kind of like a Ju-88, doesn't it? But anyway, so this was a light bomber, which was designed by and built for the Imperial Japanese Navy in the later years of World War II. It was designed as a dedicated patrol and also anti-submarine bomber, and was the first dedicated anti-submarine aircraft built anywhere in the world, according to this. And the Q1W was specifically designed to use 2 lower-powered engines to increase the range and flight time and reduce fuel consumption. The large glazed windows provided excellent visibility to help search for submarines, and the aircraft was fitted with a magnetic anomaly detector and a simple search radar to allow for non-visual detection targets. The main issue with this vehicle, when it comes to War Thunder, is that it can only carry 2 250 kilo bombs. That is pretty much it. When it comes to its general other loadouts, such as its armament, it could have 1 or 2 fixed 20mm Type 99 cannons in the nose, and then 1 7.7mm Type 92 machine gun in a dorsal mount turret, which would be behind. But unfortunately for, at least unfortunately for me, when I have a look at it, I can't find the turret anywhere on the vehicle. I'm not even sure if it had this turret. There is one picture of a drawing with it on, but that's about it. I think where it's supposed to go, because this is like, I think this is like it in US service, or captured one for the US, or a similar aircraft to it in the US. But if you have a look at this machine, I think it's supposed to go in the back of the canopy, like where my mouse is here. I think it's supposed to come out here, but I'm not entirely sure. So yeah. Anyway, so this would be a machine which would not really be able to defend itself too much. It also had really weak engines. Like, we're talking about the general maximum speed of this thing being 322 kilometers per hour, or 200 miles per hour. This thing used 2 Hitachi GK2s, 610 horsepower each. This really is a very late war recon aircraft to all extents. The next vehicle we're having a look at is the King 6, I believe it's how you say it, and this is from It's Lu Bu. And what this is, well, a BE6, but slightly changed. I think is maybe the way to put it. Depends which version you use. But basically, the King 6 was originally produced as the BE6, which we already have in the Soviet tech tree as a premium, and it was primarily operated by the Soviet Navy in many different roles. The gull-winged flying boats, it was also operated by the PNLAF, which is the People's Liberation Naval Air Force, or as we know it, the Chinese Naval Air Force, or the Chinese Fleet Air Arm, depending on how you you want to put it, and it could be used as a reconnaissance, a supply, mine laying, or torpedo, or bombing strike machine, and also a transport aircraft. It was an all-metal aircraft divided into 8 compartments. This improved buoyancy and also survivability of the machine, and they received about 6 of them. Some sources do state up to 20, but there are confirmed 6 of these, and they were introduced in the 1960s in China, and to be able to patrol its coastal waters. And they were used up until the 1970s, and then they actually had a change. So the engines on these King 6s pretty much wore out from use. So they were Shvetsov radial engines, and they decided to replace them with some turboprop engines, the Wojiang WJ6, and these were license-produced versions of the Ivchenko AI-20 engines, which were from the Soviet Union. So if you wanted to make this different from the Soviet one, you could. You could give it engines which are more upgraded, I suppose, turboprop engines for this machine. And at this stage, the aircraft became designated as the King 6. And they would go on to stay in service until the 90s. Now, there is the problem with this vehicle is after having a look around and finding some different stuff on it, one thing definitely stands out. The fact is, nobody seems to know what armaments this thing actually carried. There is, like, if you have a look at pictures of this machine, according to, the forum post here, this thing could carry up to 523mm, which is obviously the same or very similar to the Soviet one, but I can't find a picture, and also I can't find a source which actually says that it ever had that many. I think every source that I found and every tale or every plane that I found, it's talked about how they removed some of the guns out of the back, so I think this thing only had 323mm. The other thing as well, when it comes to its general bomb loads or general, ordnance, it's really hard to work out what this thing had. I mean, even in the forum post, it says bombs, general ordnance, or 2 1,000 kilo torpedoes, or 8 mines. Like, that's it. And that's the issue with this aircraft. There isn't a lot of information about its general armaments, which is a bit of a problem. Moving on, we have from Shepherd FR the Fiat G50 Series 1. Now, the Fiat G50 Series 1 is very similar to the Fiat G50 Series 2 that we already have in-game. And the main difference between the Series 2 and the Series 1, or pretty much the only difference, is actually the cockpit and its canopy design. So the canopy on the Series 1 was a closed canopy. And this obviously would become the norm later in World War II and then post-World War II. But generally, when you have a look at Italian pilots' thoughts during pre-World War II and also during World War II, they really didn't like closed canopies. And there were a few reasons for this. And the first reason was that the sliding canopy roof that was used, it wasn't actually made of glass. It was made of this plexiglass stuff, and it was easily scratched, and it meant that visibility could be poor. Then it also slowed down the pilots getting in and out of the plane, and also exhaust fumes could easily accumulate in the enclosed cockpit itself, creating issues with illness and also unreadiness when it came to flying. So what happened is after creating this closed canopy cockpit in the Series 1, the Fiat decided to create the Series 2, which had an open canopy cockpits, because all the pilots said that they really didn't like the closed set. So the Series 2 in-game is just this vehicle, but with an open cockpit. That's it. There is no difference. You know, the engine's the same, the guns are the same, you know, the general structure is the same. The only difference is the canopy. So yeah, it's pretty similar to the other ones that we have in the game, but it still would be nice to see, I suppose. The next one is a weird and wonderful aircraft, and this is from Cade. And as you can see, this one definitely has a place in the history books. It's another weird and wacky French design, and this is the Arsenal-Dellane 10C2. This plane is very weird, let's just say, and it is another one of those planes which was designed by Maurice-Dellane, and it was built for obviously the Arsenal-de l'Aéronautique, and the fact is, they went for the Nenadovich biplane configuration, but the plane was never finished by the French. It was another one of these prototypes, which was captured by the Germans after the invasion of France, and the Germans actually took it on as a vehicle to kind of see, you know, what was going on with it. So when they captured the plane, it obviously wasn't finished, but the Germans put it through trials, and the Germans recorded 15 test flights in France with it, with 6 hours of total flight time, and on the 12th or 14th of July 1943, the fighter was eventually ferried to a German experimental center for further tests, and it was tested at DFS, led by Felix Kracht. But it was subsequent history is unknown, so it kind of disappeared, unfortunately. But the plane was full metal, just like a lot of French fighters at the time. It had an all-metal stress skin construction. They used a sandwich technique with a smooth-skinned welded to a corrugated sheet, and the tandem wing was offering a continuous slot effect and offering exceptional CG travel. And a pilot and a rear gunner would be sitting in the rear of the plane under a single canopy, and that is the interesting thing. Let's see if I can actually find you a picture of this, because this is where it gets wacky, right? Now, look at this design. Do you see how the cockpit is actually on the back of the plane right here? How interesting is that? So yeah, you'd have a pilot and also a tail gunner who would be sat in the back, and this meant that the rear gunner who was there, they actually had great visibility of being able to pretty much hit anything they wanted, because the back was completely open, so there was no dead zone at all for any guns that want to be back there. It was powered by a Hispano-Suiza 12Y CRS with a 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon in the hub of it, and there was also two 7.5s in the wings, and the rear gunner was armed with twin 7.5mm as well. And the undercarriage was at first fixed, but the Germans modified the plane to have retractable undercarriage and a tail wheel to reduce the drag in the air. So yeah, I don't think the guns were actually ever properly fitted on this. I've never actually found a source, but it was proposed to have that 20mm and also the 7.5s, and obviously the flexibly mounted 7.5s in the rear cockpit. So yeah, a crazy design from the French, which would be lovely to see. And then we have the Swedes with a Sternjäger, and the vehicle we're looking at today is the HE115 T2 for Sweden. Now, this is a plane which isn't Swedish. It's bought by Sweden with a Swedish name, and basically this is another Heinkel, a German boy. And before this Heinkel, though, the Swedes operated the T1, which was known as the Heinkel HD16. It wasn't great, and they were looking for a replacement in 1938, and another Heinkel design was chosen to replace it. This is the HE115, and 12 A2 variant planes were ordered in the summer of 1938. They were delivered in 1939 and were assigned to the F2 wing based at Hagenäs, and the plane was seen as a pretty nice plane. You know, it kind of did what it needed to do. It was a sturdy machine, and it behaved well both in the air and also on the water, since this is a float plane, as you can see from these pictures. That is a pretty fun little picture. Hey, look, a cow. But but yeah, this is basically what it looked like, and this is it in, I believe, Finnish service as well. Because obviously they use some of them. Let's go back to a nice picture. There we go. You can see the booty. So they contributed a lot to ensure the Sweden neutrality was kept, and also it was intended, if required, to perform torpedoing and also classic bombing, smoke screening, and reconnaissance missions. So this thing had 2 defensive guns. It had 2 8mm machine guns on it, which, you know, one in the front, of course, and one in, I believe, the top area of the mounting. Then you have a bunch of external loadouts that it would carry on the wings: 5 250s, 2 250s, and 1 500, 2 500s, 1 M38 torpedo, or an M41 torpedo. So it would be, I think, the first Swedish floatplane, if this thing was ever added, and with the ever-expanding naval in the game, it is definitely something to look forward to. Anyway, that is all of the suggestions past the developers for Aviation for the month of July 2020. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. I'd like to thank Ambrosius McClellan, B. Young, Battling Bacon, Blackie, Chris Giltnane, Conte Baraka, Daniel Stanton, Elove Goat, Jay Wilt, Martinez, Trigger Hippie, Universe, Eugens Terry, and also I'm Devilish and Samuel Slick for supporting the channel.